Albert Cheng, how are you doing?
I'm good, David. It's been a long time.
Yeah, it has. Let's see, you are currently in Los Angeles, am I correct?
I am in LA. Yep.
And we're not going to talk about this in great detail, but you are in the entertainment business. You are in the on the business side of show business. You've been quite successful as a producer and a distributor of filmed entertainment. Is that a good way to summarize what you do?
Yeah, I think I've done a lot of different jobs in this business. I probably have done everything, including one day in Disneyland parks sweeping up garbage. So that counts for a lot of different types of roles. It's something that I didn't think that I was going to do as a career, and just sort of landed in it in a very kind of circuitous way. So if you told me back then I would be doing what I'd be doing, I'd be probably laughing at that possibility.
Well, let's tell people how we know each other. You and I were in the class of 1988 at Punahou School in Honolulu, Hawaii. We knew each other a little bit. I wouldn't say that we hung out too much or considered ourselves great friends, but over the years, I've certainly followed what you've been doing where I can, whether it's on social media or whatnot. But one huge thing that we have in common is that we spent very formative years in the same place at the same time, and so we're definitely going to have um, some overlapping perspectives to share. But I'd love to know your story. And so why don't we start with the story of your family?
Mhm.
Um, I guess we'll start on the Cheng side of the family. Who are they? Where are they from? And how did they end up in Hawaii?
Yeah. So both sets of parents, the Cheng side and my mom's side, they were born and raised in China, and this was pre-communism. So it was the Chiang Kai-shek regime, which was sort of the early start of trying to build a democracy. And if you follow Chinese history in the 40s, when communism sort of took over, um, a lot of the people in that government had to flee. And both sets of my parents were involved in the government one way or another. And they fled to Taiwan, one to Taiwan and one to Macau. And essentially, they spent the rest of their sort of teenage and lives there. And then my dad wound up going to study in the States for his undergrad. And he studied at Oklahoma State University, and then went on to MIT for his master's, and then Stanford his PhD, and then worked for NASA for a little bit on the space program. And ultimately, I think he then decided to go back to Taiwan to find a wife. So went to Taiwan, and that's where he met my mom through, I think it was my grandparents. They sort of introduced each other. They got married in Taiwan, and my dad got an offer to teach at the University of Hawaii, and that's where I was born. Probably not too long after they had moved there. So that's kind of how I got there.
What part of China was your dad from?
From Canton province, so where Hong Kong is. And my mom is from Shanghai, that area.
What languages were spoken in your home when you were growing up?
Pretty much Mandarin Chinese was spoken at the home, and usually it was them speaking to me in Chinese and me answering back in English.
No, no Cantonese?
No Cantonese, to the disappointment of my grandfather, who is Cantonese, and my grandmother, who's Cantonese. But they also spoke Mandarin. It was because it's the common language, so they could go between the two. And so I consider myself, partly Cantonese, partly Shanghainese, I guess, but
How is your Chinese today?
horrible.
So if you
It's
were to take a trip to Taiwan, would people tell pretty quickly that you did not grow up speaking a lot of Chinese?
Yeah, probably because when I would try, and the words would probably not come out very smoothly. I'd probably have a really strong American accent on top of that.
So you were born and you grew up in Hawaii. As you were growing up, how did you think of yourself sort of from an identity perspective? Was your family telling you, we're Chinese? Did you think of yourself as American? Did you say I'm a guy in Hawaii? How did that enter your mind?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think I was identity confused because in many ways, you're an immigrant to Hawaiian culture, right? Because my parents were not a part of the local community. My parents' friends were other Chinese immigrants that also spoke Chinese. I think they're same generation who had come to Hawaii, and most of them were UH professors. So actually, like all my dad's and my parents' friends were all UH professors who had come from China, who had studied in the States, and had all like settled in Hawaii. There were probably 2 dozen of them, and that was the childhood community that I knew. And so when I went to school, totally different set. So I felt a little bit like an immigrant in Hawaii because I had this really small Chinese American sort of cadre of people that I spent a lot of my off out of school time hours with. And so I learned Hawaiian culture, but I looked at it from the outside in. Um, I felt American by watching American TV. I would have to say probably one of the biggest reasons why I'm probably doing what I'm doing is the strong influence that TV set had in front of me. And in many cases, my mom and my wife both learned how to speak English by watching television. My mom did not take any formal language, nothing. She literally watched American television and taught herself English while living in Hawaii, by the way. So that was
That's quite a feat.
yeah.
Just briefly, what topic did your father teach at UH?
Mechanical engineering.
Yeah, so we're not talking about me, but I forgot that your father was at UH. So was mine. My father taught economics at UH. I'm glad you mentioned TV. Do you remember any particular shows that you were, really into?
I watched almost everything. I would have to say the early wow, and early. I mean, if you go really early, what you're really into is the Electric Company, Sesame Street, keeps going. And then I probably watched. I definitely did my 10,000 hours of TV before probably the age of 6 or 7. I watched a lot. I watched All in the
So you're a
Family.
TV expert because of
I
it.
All in the Family, Jeffersons. You keep going like Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley. I mean, I just kept watching Chips. I mean, you can just keep going. But it was a huge part of growing up for me.
What was the policy in your home about watching TV? Were your parents like, yeah, knock yourself out, watch 10 hours in a row, no big deal? Or were there some guardrails around it?
There were no guardrails. It was watch whatever, get your homework done, and it's fine. And so I watched a lot of things that probably as a 6-year-old you shouldn't watch, like Three's Company. So I watched probably every episode of Three's Company. Probably didn't understand most of it in terms of the innuendo, but the physical comedy was probably enough.
What was your parents' attitude about sort of becoming an American? Did they say, hey, look, here we are in America, you got to try to become American? Or was it more like, don't forget that you're Chinese, don't become too American?
Yeah, I would say wow, sometimes I think my parents really didn't do a lot of parenting. They would say you're American, but they always reminded me of my cultural heritage. So it was very important for me to understand um, where I came from, Chinese culture, Chinese values, the value system. Um, Obviously Asian food is constantly there. So there was always a tie back to it, and it was always a reminder. And they wanted to make sure that I didn't forget it. They actually made me take Chinese classes. See, obviously it didn't help. I still don't know Chinese, but I had to take reading and writing, all of that, all the way through till probably in 5th grade. Almost to the point. Well, even at Punahou, I took Chinese, and Mrs. Staub was really clear about like I'm going to make it much harder for you in this class because you have an unfair advantage, taking beginning Chinese, starting in 7th grade. Um, but never was disconnected from it. And being an American was also important to them because for them it was important for me to succeed in the U.S. And so they wanted me to embrace both cultures, pretty equally.
What neighborhood did you grow up in when you were, in your small kid days? And can you just describe the neighborhood and the kind of kids you played with? What would you do? What was the mix like?
Yeah, I would say it was I live in Hawaii Kai, which is on the east side of the island near Hanauma Bay. In fact, just minutes away from Hanauma Bay, in a little sort of planned division called Mariners Cove. I did hang out with some neighbors, and it was just basically riding your bike, somewhere in a cul-de-sac. It was pretty diverse, but not as diverse as you wanted. I mean, the diversity you get in Hawaii was basically either white or Asian, and that was as much as but it was pretty diverse. And most of the kids were most likely kids of professors. I think, I had some really good friends when I was a kid. I think there was a guy who went to Punahou too, Isaac Kato. He was always someone who I kind of lived vicariously through because he was really a kind of interesting guy, and then his parents moved away, lived in Chicago, and then he'd come back and he'd tell me about like what Chicago was like. And it was one of those things where you would live in Hawaii for so long, you don't really know what it's like to be a kid elsewhere, and you kind of see it through TV and film. At least that's how I saw it, but I never got the real stories. And then I grew up with Chris Ye. And so, I think Chris has always been influential because he always challenges me in terms of like, Chris has just such a sharp wit, and I learn a lot from him. And so he's definitely someone who pushed sort of the intellectual, kind of rigor or desire to like read more and learn more about a lot of different things.
And he's quite a musical guy, right? So that was,
Mhm.
uh,
Yeah.
did you develop an interest in music through him or, talk about that?
Well, I think on music, I played the piano, but that was part of it because every Chinese kid gets forced to learn piano by by their parents. Piano was sort of the first thing that started where I started writing my own music, because after a while of learning, I sat with my piano teacher and I said, I'm kind of bored. Like I want to start writing stuff.
That's interesting. I mean, you grew up in a pretty intellectual household, but creativity is sort of its own thing. Where do you think your creative impulse came from?
It's a good question. I think, I actually do think my parents were also creative, but they chose professions that were more scientific because it was very much a decision around building a career. So like when I asked my dad and poke a little bit, he would tell me like, yeah, I used to want to be a writer and a director. I'm like, oh, that's where it comes from. And my mom used to be an artist. Like she actually, when she was in Hawaii, she used to paint a lot.
So when did you start at Punahou?
I started in 1981, 1980, 81. My first year was in sixth grade. I started going to summer school at Punahou, and I would take classes, and I would love it because it was by and far the best experience, relative to what I was experiencing in public school. And then it got to the point where I actually asked my parents, like, "Hey, I don't really want to go to this school, this public school. I'm not enjoying it. Like, I want to go to Punahou." And at the time, it was like, I don't think my parents thought of it. And it was expensive, on a professor's salary. Punahou can be pretty, this tuition's not cheap. And so, but they saw how much I loved it and said, "Well, let's test. Why don't you go through the test?" And you go through this, the test and then the interview with the Punahou teacher. And then I got in, and my parents finally decided, it's like, okay, let's send him. And one of the things where what I didn't know was in order for me to go to Punahou and ultimately then my sister, my dad wound up drawing from his pension at the UH in order to pay for it. And they tell me this after because when I finally graduated from college, my dad he retired from the UH and then he took us another job to go to Hong Kong to be a professor. And I said, "Well, why would you want to do that?" It's like, "Well, uh, I need to put some savings in the account." I'm like, "Didn't you put savings?" Like, "Well, not really. I drew all that down for you to go to Punahou." And boy, that makes you feel really good. And so he wound up taking a second, third career and was in Asia for like 25 years and sort of made his retirement back and then moved back to the States.
Well, I want to get to high school, but between sixth grade and eighth grade, what were some highlights? What were some notable accomplishments, disasters that you can tell us about?
Oh man, the only thing I really remember was Bishop Hall and members only jackets. Those are like the things that just stood out, like lots of members only jackets,
Did,
different
did, did you
colors.
did you own a members only jacket?
I did not.
Why
And
not?
I was obsessed with it because I couldn't afford one. And so any members only jacket I think was so cool, and I didn't have one. What else? I mean, I think Bishop was cool. I think I still remember Mr. Eldridge's class. I think that, that's still, Hawaiiana always still really, I think those, I never forget those classes because I really enjoyed those. And sort of, being born and raised in Hawaii, I just felt like I have to know this, and it's important to understand Hawaiian culture. All you remember is just the awkwardness of like going through puberty. And I left and was gone for about a whole semester in eighth grade, and spent it in Germany. And my dad homeschooled me for the rest of that term, and I would be sending in all my work back to Punahou so that they could give me credit for that half of the year so that I can go on. But what was so interesting was that like there were a bunch of cliques and a bunch of friends like that were eighth grade, and just it took one semester and coming back and everything was different. I'm like, what happened between eighth grade and freshman year? Like everyone's social circles had changed. I'm like, well, how did that happen over a semester?
Okay, so you get back, you're now completely German. You get back to Hawaii and you're in high school. What are your first memories? How do you think you fit in?
Still felt like I was someone on the outside looking in. Again, it's like, nothing's changed, right? I'm sort of, my parents had a very small circle of, UH professor kid communities, all Chinese. When I first came back, I think a lot of the people that I had like hung out with, even eighth grade, were so all like in different social circles. I was kind of just doing whatever. I spent a lot of time with Kimo Proudfoot in those days as a freshman. Awesome guy. Kimo's awesome.
He also found his way to the filmed entertainment industry.
He did. And then relationships over time just kept changing, but it still felt like uh, someone from the outside looking in, just because I didn't I sort of bounced around different people, but I wasn't really I'm not sure you could say I was tied to any like social circle, like, or of a significant size. I was just sort of all roaming around Punahou doing my thing.
Well, what was it that made you feel outside?
Yeah, I don't know. It's like maybe it's just me. I think maybe it was just I was so determined just to get through school that I didn't invest the time either to kind of hang out with people or even like build a lot of these relationships. It was basically school, and then I decided to like do speech debate, and then I decided to do track and cross country, and that was like my life. I wasn't quite sure where I would actually figure out how I could fit in anywhere. I was just always so busy doing stuff.
Sometimes people who are outsiders or believe themselves to be outsiders have make very good observations of whatever society they're part of because they sort of see it from a different perspective. What observations do you have about our high school, whether it was the social mix, the ethnic mix, that you sort of noticed when you got to high school?
You didn't see a whole lot of racial diversity in our groups. The weirdest thing is I think, coming out of high school, you see a lot more engagement between different groups of people, right? It's like, but when you're in school, I think people kind of glob on to people that they feel comfortable with, whether it's either, racial, ethnic, whatever. And, even though as much as Hawaii is a melting pot, there's still kind of like what I would call self segregation. It's more partly driven out of comfort, right, and just familiarity and sort of understanding, and understanding where everyone's coming from. And to be honest, I don't think people notice it. It's not a conscious thing. It just happens. And I think even I didn't even notice it until you sort of when I actually um, until I came to the mainland. And wow, racial tension conflict is like, whoa. When I finally went to college and I started like experiencing what it's like to live in a more quote multi-racial community with conflict, then you're like, whoa, what's going on? And also feeling more and more like the minority coming to the mainland, more so than being you know um, in the majority. Because I think Asians who grew up in Hawaii have the benefit of being in a little bit more. There's more Asians, so there isn't feeling of a minority, feel. And so until you get to the mainland, you realize, wow, different perspectives. And it's the same thing when I compare notes with Asians who grew up in Minnesota. I'll have these conversations, and they'll go, "Oh, where did you?" And they don't know where I grew up, and I say, "Oh, where did you grow up?" I say, "I grew in Hawaii," and they go, "Oh, yeah, that makes total sense." I'm like, "What do you mean?" Like you act like someone who grew up in Hawaii. Like, no, help me understand what that means. It's like they'd say, "You have no baggage." I'm like, "Oh, that's interesting. What does that mean?" And I think part of it is, maybe not having as a huge self-awareness of like, oh, that I am Asian in what I, in this in the mainland, while others are very conscientious and use it as and almost have defensive mechanisms all the time. I don't have that experience, so for me, it's like I don't quite understand that, but then I can at the same time.
Well, even though Hawaii arguably certainly has less of the ethnic tensions that one would find on the mainland, what was the closest you got to feeling like kind of a racist moment, or like a little bit sad that there were these divisions, or that you were perceived in a way that you didn't want to be perceived?
What period of time? I
I guess
definitely.
high schools, seventh to eighth grade high school.
Yeah, I never got that in being in Hawaii actually. That was maybe it's just being a kid, you didn't notice it. I think the biggest I get the biggest time that I felt it was in Boston, where I went to school. My first job in Boston, I think I felt more like a minority than anything else. But there was also like during that job, I was a consultant at the time, and I would spend our client was a company in Tampa, Florida, Bradenton, Florida, near Tampa. And I remember walking out there, and this kid that comes up to me and says, "Hi, where are you from?" And I said, "Oh, I'm from Boston." And the kid's like, "No, no, 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 you're not from Boston. Uh, I mean, where are you really from?" I said, "No, I'm from Boston." It's like, "You're not from Boston. You don't look like someone who's." I'm like, this was a kid.
Let's move on to, I guess, intellectual growth. Do you remember any particular concepts, classes, professors that really resonated with you, that have stayed with you?
Yes. Dr. Healy, his class, Ideas in Western Literature. Awesome class. I don't remember every single thing in that class, but I do remember that it shaped the way you thought about life, or you thought about like literature or ideas, concepts. Existentialism. Oh, that's, talk about, just blowing your mind when you're in high school about French existentialism. But it was, and the people that I was in with Chris Ye, Karen Elizaga was in my class. It was a really good class. Matt Uyagalele, I think, was in my class too. So it was just an awesome class, awesome, awesome teacher, and the material was so good. I think to this day, that's the one class that I think I still take away from that has had more of a profound impact.
Did your social horizons expand? Did you sort of start to add new elements, activities, or friends into your general, circle?
Yeah, I think, all the people that I interacted with were people that I were heavily in my, in extracurricular activities. I mean, two other really good friends of mine in high school were Daryl Higa and Charles Dejoux. And because we were on a debate team and we'd spend every weekend together debating and doing extemporaneous speaking competitions. But it was always contained around things that I did. And I only did a few things. I wasn't involved with a lot of different things in high school. It was just, I picked a couple of things. I'm just going to do speech and debate all 4 years, and I'm going to do cross country track as many years as I can. I think I didn't do it my senior year, but I did it for a good chunk. And those were the crowds the people that I knew.
Did you go to parties?
Yeah, I was not. My parents were super like strict. I couldn't leave the house. The rules were no dating, no dating, no parties. And the only way that I could, and that was, I mean, in some ways too, that very strict sort of rules forced me to like engage in other activities because I would have been bored out of my mind. And so that's why I spent a lot of time in speech and debate. That was what my weekends were. Friday nights preparing for the debates, getting up early at 5 in the morning, getting dressed up in a suit and then figuring out which high school we were going to drive to and compete for Saturday. And then Sunday, you're just sort of like, getting ready for Monday. And that was kind of like the whole year. And like you're competing, trying to get to state championships. And
I want to go back to your revelation about no dating. Where did that come from? Were they Christian? Were they just conservative? What was behind that?
no, I was behind is like if you date, your grades will suffer. So therefore you will not do that. So I'm like, okay, I got it. So that became so I guess it paid off. And so
It paid off in that you got good grades.
yeah, my grades were fine. They never complained about it. I think I was probably more hard on myself when I didn't get the grade that I wanted. But that was kind of for them. It was more like anything less than an A minus in any subject was probably not good enough. And so getting straight A's was kind of like the goal.
Did you pine for romance as a young man? Did you think, I wish I could date?
Like any red-blooded human being, yes. But the thing is that no, can't do anything. Gotta focus on my work, and for the most part did. And I had a lot of good friends, were awesome. But a lot of it was just really focused on studying. If you know me, I'm probably somewhere studying in some hall, in some deep dark corner in a building, because it was the only thing that I was able to spend my time doing.
How much of that do you think was self-motivated, that you really believed, like, I want to excel at academics and not just I'm afraid of my parents?
Uh, I think it starts out as a little bit of that. I think that, because my parents were they strict. I mean, that rule came down as early as freshman year. And then you sort of follow that. But I think over time, as I started, the grades started, you started delivering, you got great grades. I think there's this sort of inner desire, like, I got to keep going, I got to keep it up. And so there'll be times where like I get a B plus on a test, and I would be so disappointed. I would sort of wallow in misery for a whole day. And my parents were like, it's just a B plus. Just make sure you get an A at the end by the end. And so it's like I think a lot of it was self-motivated too. By the time you get to by the time I got to probably junior year, it was just like, got to keep going, got to keep going.
What was the worst grade you got? Not on a test, but in a class.
In a class, I got a B plus, I think.
It's a disaster.
Is a
What
disaster.
class was it?
I think it was AP Physics. It was AP
So that
Physics.
was probably not the test that not the class that your parents were pleased that you got a B plus in, right?
No, my dad was actually pretty upset that I got a few plus in physics. And then there was one time which I got in bio class with Bill Wicking, Mr. Wicking, and I was lab partners with Errol Carroll. And we had this thing called frog dissection, if you remember that, David. And I thought we were being really clever in figuring out, like, hey, no one's ever figured out how to get to the brain from the top. Well, what happens? I wound up cutting off the entire head. And then David Buck said, "Oh my God, you could." And so he took like I don't know what it was. It might have been some kind of pin. He took the head and he started running around the classroom with the head and he planted it in the wall. And Mr. Bill was not entirely happy about that, and he gave me an F.
David Buck started an incident that led to you getting an F.
Yeah, well, I think I started the instance by cutting off the head. David Buck just showcased the head for everyone to see, and the next thing you know, Mr. Bill gave me an F, and in being the person who didn't want the F to damage my grade, I basically took on every single extra credit that I could. I'm like, okay, Mr. Bill, I do not want to get a B or whatever because of this. Like, what do I have to do to get an A? So he literally gave me like all these projects, and I wound up like turning them all in just to kind of claw my way back.
You know how it is when you grow up in Hawaii and you meet someone anywhere and they say, where are you from? And you say, well, I grew up in Hawaii. And they always say, well, like, what was that like? So what do you say when people ask you, what was it like?
Wow. I would say it's probably I appreciate my childhood in Hawaii because I think I grew up in an environment that was incredibly, even though I felt like I was on the outside in, it still had elements of a very nurturing environment. And I always think about Punahou as, an environment which shaped me in my formative years far more powerfully than anything else. Like it taught me who I was as a person, how I thought about, what my worldview was, how hard I was going to work. Because, in college and in grad school, like I don't think any of that, I mean, none of that had that same impact. And I think when you grow up as a kid and through high school in a place like Hawaii and in Punahou, it's a very nurturing environment. It's very welcoming. There's a lot of positivity in it. And I think when I see anyone who's still living in Hawaii or who are from Hawaii, like I always want to figure out how do we help that state, continue on and be the awesome place that it is. So I look on it fondly. I'm proud to say that I was born and raised in Hawaii, and to me it's like it's incomparable. It's so hard to describe to people. And I actually feel closer to most of the people I grew up with in Hawaii, even though I was outside looking in, than any group that I've met or encountered in the course of my adulthood.